Good evening, colleagues and guests. I am Eric Ip, Professor and Co-Director of the Center for Medical Ethics and Law. It is my privilege to chair today's seminar, stepping in for Professor Gilberto Leung, who is unable to attend due to an urgent appointment. Our speaker, Professor Yan Jolly, is a valued friend of our center, and as Director of the Center of Genomics and Policy at McGill University, he holds the title of James McGill Professor in the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences, and serves as an associate member of the Department of Equity, Ethics, and Policy and the Law Faculty, recognized as an emeritus advocate by the Quebec Bar in 2012 and a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences in 2017. Yan has authored over 250 peer-reviewed articles and established the world's first international genetic discrimination observatory in 2018. His globally acclaimed work explores the nexus of health law, bioethics, and emerging technologies. Today's seminar discusses the rapid advancements in synthetic biology, gene editing, and AI-driven tools, which have expanded dual-use research of concern and pose new challenges for global biosafety governance. Amid geopolitical tensions, we will explore the risks of biological threats, limitations of frameworks like the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, and the need for verification, cooperation, and adaptive legal tools to prevent misuse while preserving genomic potential. And our seminar will last for 1 hour. After Yan's presentation, there will be a Q&A session. So please join me in welcoming Professor Yan Zhang.
Thank you very much. I'll be standing up. Thank you, Eric, for the very kind introduction. This is like a second home away from home. I'm there at least once a year, and it's a pleasure to see my colleagues here every time I come. And so I also want to thank the Wing Foundation that makes these things possible. And today, yes, I'll be presenting on the topic of biosafety. I do want to correct a little bit, some of the abstract, because after giving it a lot of thought, the presentation I'll give today, it really is a data governance presentation, but it's really introducing this issue of biosecurity into genomic data governance, which is not something that we used to discuss a lot in that space before. And so that's sort of what I want to do, is really starting with the beginning, talking a little bit about, what is data governance, what's the point of genomic data governance, and then moving into one of this most recent challenge to data governance, which is that challenge of safety, biosecurity. So this is just a little bit of background to make you see that basically now we're having such a huge amount of genomic data that we're storing that things have gotten extremely complex. And so we talk about exabyte of data, and you see how this has progressed from 153 exabyte to over 2,000 exabyte of data in just 12 years. And what is really interesting is I remember in 2013, I was a member of the International Cancer Genome Consortium, which was a large-scale consortium that mission of that consortium was to sequence over 30 genome tumor cancer genome tumor. So basically, we would produce data, we would sequence the tumors, and we basically generated at the time petabytes of data. We were over 20 countries contributing to the International Cancer Genome Consortium. And what's really interesting is we were the first consortium at the time to basically come to the conclusion that we're generating too much data. We're generating petabytes of data, which at the time was huge, and we can't do it without cloud computing. So we were the first, I would say, international research project to actually decide to put genomic data on the cloud. And this was at the time very much new. And it was a very interesting experience because we had to basically negotiate with the Google and Amazon of this world to try and work a scheme, because they were all interested to do it with us, because they wanted to demonstrate that they had that capacity to store genomic data, just like they could store financial data. But the problem is that a lot of the tools that they had in terms of legal tools and protection were designed for financial data and not for health data. And so it was a lot of work. But all that to say that now cloud computing, when you're talking about international genomic research, it's become the norm. And big data research has become the gold standard in genomics. Why? Because of all kinds of factors. We're all now dealing with electronic health record. And of course, you're not just talking about genomic data, you're talking about all that other metadata that comes with it. Genomic data in itself is not that useful. It becomes interesting when the data is enriched by all kinds of other types of data. And now we know that also sometimes we have those algorithms that will also account for medical imaging on top of the medical data, the standard medical data and the genomic data. And there are different tools to collect the data, to sequence the data that weren't there before. And we've shifted, and we can discuss about how much that is reflected in Hong Kong. But I definitely see it in my country, in Canada. We're shifting towards what we call learning healthcare systems. And what that means is that we're moving from research to clinical care, back to research. There's like a circle, and it's moving at a faster and faster pace. We used to have a very clear border for lawyers between medical research and clinical care. Medical research was about trying to improve the art of medicine for the common good, while clinical treatment, clinical care was about treating an individual patient. And so we had different rules for research and then for clinical care. And of course, the rule for research were more stringent because the research was done for the greater good of the population and not necessarily for the person in front of you. But things are changing. And now many research projects in genomic end up producing clinically useful results. And a lot of the project that some of my colleagues are starting, projects, for example, like a project which sequences in pediatric care children which have rare cancer and have no solution. So the project proposed to sequence them because it's the last alternative to try and understand the type of cancer they have and to try to find a cure. So it's a research project, but actually we might end up uncovering some kind of treatment. And if that's the case, of course, it's the last hope for these children. So this would return to them. So that's a little bit what we mean by this learning healthcare system, is that idea that every patient contribute to the research pool by providing their data and to quality control measures. So the hospital is much more informed of what they're doing. Research and measuring of care is done in a much more coherent manner. But and at the condition that, of course, the data be returned to the benefit of the patient, and that there are security measures, etc., to make sure that all these sharing of information between multiple actors that wasn't there before is done in a safe and secure manner. And of course, it also speaks to the importance of data for rare disease and precision therapeutics. We live in a day and age where it's not just liver cancer. No, there's all kinds of different liver cancer depending on different genetic mutation you might have, and you might react to treatment differently. The cancer might be more aggressive. So we work in a world more and more where there are different subtypes of disease, smaller groups of patients. And what that means is that it's really difficult to have sufficient data for some of these groups of patients who have rarer type of disease. Again, the solution is international collaboration, data sharing, and trying to get your hands on as much data set as possible. And we can discuss some of the solution that has been adopted in that context. And finally, we arrive at today's world where, yes, we have realized the potential of big data. We have realized what data sharing can do for health, research, and just the quality of care. But at the same time, we live in a period of great tension around the world. And so it's becoming really challenging to do this type of international research. And so I'll go more in detail about some of those challenges. This is sort of a quick overview of the different part of my talk. I'll be moving first in the data governance world. As I mentioned, I just want to introduce the concept. Data governance is really the idea of somebody exercising authority and controlling an infrastructure, and the infrastructure containing data or sample. Of course, we're talking about databases and biobank. And we'll see that there's different types of control that you can have over your data. And that is also important. And usually, of course, lawyers will know that this type of the legal provision that are going to affect data sharing and data governance are usually at the national level, law being mostly a national concept. But there is still a lot happening at the international level in terms of promoting harmonization of practice and developing tools that will facilitate data sharing and making sure that we're also all curating, annotating our data set in a similar manner, and querying them, etc. And of course, the international organization are also very important in terms of learning from one another about, how to protect data, how to share data in the most convenient manner. For example, right now, one of the gold standard in terms of governance of data is probably the UK Biobank. And so I actually was in Thailand 2 weeks ago, and the UK Biobank does these conferences that we collaborate in every year, where they basically explain to people how their biobank functions and how you can actually access their data set. It's one of those, I would say, controlled access biobank. And so they want people to use their data. Of course, they built it in a way that it's quite safe for the data set, and that it's difficult to re-identify them and to breach confidentiality and data protection. And we can talk about the setup of the UK Biobank, but it's kind of perceived as the gold standard. So basically, a lot of other countries are interested in learning from the setup of the UK Biobank and how they can have national projects that are similar to that one, and laws that also will allow you to do this with your data, because you can have great idea for technical setup, but if the law doesn't allow you to do it, then it's not great help. So this is something that I find quite interesting and spend quite a lot of thought on. Is really an attempt to describe data governance and how it has evolved over the past 40 years. And so, of course, these great trends existed before. I mean, commercialization is not something that necessarily started in the 1980s, but it definitely started in the 1980s in the world of genomics. And how did it start? It started by the US adopting at that time a law called the Bayh-Dole Act. And that law, basically what it did is it encouraged university researcher to patent their invention. And basically was saying, we fund you, researcher, make money, is the short message of that law. And that started what we call the patent gold rush in genomics, where basically researchers were attempting to patent everything and anything in the field of genomics and genetics, including human genes. And of course, a lot of these patents were invalidated later on, but the commercialization trends has persisted in the private sector. And what that means is that the goal of the governance in the scheme of commercialization is really to generate profit with the data. And we talk about the private sector will use intellectual property and commercial secrecy to basically protect their asset, protect their database, protect the content of the database, and they'll talk about data ownership, that they're owning this data. On the complete opposite side of the spectrum, with the Human Genome Project, we saw in the late 1990s, early 2000, this idea that, well, I mean, it's all well and good to want to make money, but the reality is, if we want to progress quickly in genomics, we have to collaborate. And the Human Genome Project basically established that. At that time, what happened is that public researchers actually that were involved in the Human Genome Project were competing with a private company at the time called Celera Genomics to see who would be the first to win the race and to sequence the human genome. And the Human Genome Project, the public project, ended up winning that race. But even Celera Genomics at the end actually contributed. So it ended up with an alliance between the private and public sector, and actually a declaration a joint declaration at the time by the US president and the UK prime minister that both concluded that, well, genomic data should be seen as a public good, and the sequences should be shared. And so there was a big push towards open science at that time in genomics, and a strong message sent by governments of developed countries, the US and the UK, for example, that this was the thing to do in genomics. Of course, this didn't really suit everybody, and there are reasons for that. I mean, open science in theory is fantastic. One problem with it, however, is that if everybody can have access to genomic data, who's going to make the most out of the data and actually develop drugs, medication, and make profit is the country that have the infrastructure to do this. Hence, the countries that have the most developed manufacturing center, sequencing center, etc. So basically, developed countries. But of course, the global South has no interest at this moment in open science because they see this, and we saw it at the time of the pandemic as well. People from developed countries are just going to come visit us, take our genetic resources, sample our population, do research with us, and then make all the profit, and we'll never see medication. So the idea behind the trend of data sovereignty, which is a more recent trend, and which has been really started by equity-seeking population from the global South, indigenous groups as well, is to say, we don't trust you. I mean, people from developed countries have come to our countries, have, sequenced us, have played us for many years. So therefore, we don't want to participate in genetics and genetic research unless we co-develop the rules. That's the condition for us to trust you. And we also want to share in the benefit, and we want that to be clear from the onset. And we see it in the current treaty of WHO, which is trying to establish this pandemic treaty, which is exactly one of the motivation behind this treaty is how can we make sure that in time of pandemics where we need data from all over the world rapidly, everybody contributes and everybody wins. Of course, it's easier said than done. And the last trend I want to introduce is data nationalism. And that is the trend that we've seen, I would say, in the latest, 2 years. And it's emerged, that trend, because of the global tension. And the idea there is to say that, well, data is a national resource. It's a question of national security, that the country be the one that actually have the responsibility of the genomic data. And therefore, we're going to decide at the national level for both reasons of biosecurity. So because we think that genomic can be weaponized, but also for reason, and sometimes it's really the true reason is very often one of economic competition, is that we're afraid that another country is going to be more competitive than us and is going to use our data to invent, etc. So we basically invoke this idea that it's a national resource. And you see it in recent decision in the US, in Canada, and in China, where there are blacklists in every of these three countries recently, and more countries are coming into that trend, where basically in Canada, I have to be careful about who, for example, I'm collaborating with in China. I have a list of a list of centers that if I want to receive Canadian funding, I cannot collaborate with. And of course, the same thing exists in China and in the United States as well. And of course, there are more than one countries on those lists. I'm just citing some examples. So, why share data? Why keep data private? These are some of the key points that get discussed when considering whether to go more open science or whether to protect the data. Some of the main advantage of open science is faster, more coherent, and scientifically rigorous research. Of course, you see what everybody's doing because you have access to all the data set, and people are forced by journal to publish the data that underpins their scientific conclusion. So you can test those conclusions. It avoids duplication. It makes things much more smoother and coherent in the research ecosystem. And of course, there's more information available, and we can find solution for patient, for example, with rare diseases. And it also provide for more opportunity to train young people to work on that data because they can have access to all of those data sets which are openly accessible and use it for their training. Same thing for AI. So there's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence and bias. Why are there bias? Because the data we're feeding into our computers, into our algorithm, is biased data in the first place. If we can have huge data set that are representative of different types of population group, the chances for bias are reduced. So it's also a better way to train AI system. Of course, it's not all perfect. There are challenges with going for the open access route. Genomic data can and has been used to discriminate or stigmatize population group or individuals in the past. You've heard about the Genetic Discrimination Observatory, which is one of my long-standing research projects to prevent genetic discrimination. It can be used to blackmail people. Your medical information, especially if it is stigmatizing, can be used for blackmail purpose. A classic case is that of actor Charlie Sheen, who was HIV positive, and this was a secret for many years. But some ill-intentioned people found out about it, and for many years they were basically charging him not to reveal that secret. Eventually, he decided to go public about his medical condition because he got tired of paying, basically. But that was a typical case of blackmail. And when 23andMe, the big company that offers direct-to-consumer genetic testing, had a privacy breach a few years ago, there were a lot of rumor that some of that data had been sold on the dark web and that there were attempts to use it to blackmail as well. Misappropriation, plagiarism, this is actually what happens most of the time. The data is basically used to scoop the researchers that have produced the data and to actually come up with an innovation faster than them, or just publishing on the data faster than them, which is very frustrating because if you're the one that has taken the time to collect all those data sets and to then develop your data infrastructure, which is expensive, it's very frustrating not to reap the benefit of this. And finally, that question that we're going to explore in a few minutes of military use or dual use of genomic data. This is just to mention that there are many issues, many challenges that are associated with the governance of genomic data. Of course, because of time constraint, I'm not going to talk in any detail about all of them. I'm just going to focus on that question of dual use and cybersecurity. But I did want to say that there were a lot of other issues that one has to think about when thinking about data governance. And usually we also think about data governance along what we call the data life cycle, meaning that these issues are usually relevant at every stage of life of the data, from the time that you collect the data to the time that you're feeding back the data to the patient through the clinician. So these issues are, for example, and these are just some of the main issues. There are more, but these are those that usually come to mind. Consent. How do you make sure that people that participate to those huge resources have consented properly? Of course, the question of privacy and confidentiality is one of the foremost questions when you talk about database and biobank. There's also a question of how do you provide information to these people that have collaborated to these infrastructure in a way that is professional and safe, and also promulgate health. Uh, of course, we're now using these infrastructure to actually perform all kinds of algorithm computation to use the data for analysis. We develop risk prediction model, polygenic risk scores, all kinds of things using artificial intelligence with those data, which does create some issues. Data sharing, the fact that we're sharing data create issues in itself. I talked a little bit about benefit sharing and equitable access. It's the question of making sure that the people that provide the data are not then completely forgotten, but stand to also benefit from this participation, and that there's an equitable access also, in that everybody can use the resource and profit from the resource if it is something that is for the common good. Intellectual property questions always relevant still in that context. And finally, the two recent biggies are sustainability and cybersecurity. A word on sustainability. Sustainability is this idea of we're creating biobank and genomic database. It's very trendy, very sexy, costs a lot of money to put together. Governments are excited to fund these things. And there's so much money invested in bioinformatics. Sometimes it's kind of hallucinating to see this as a funding trend. The problem is that we end up very often with this kind of, I would say, maze where there's so many biobank and database infrastructures. And very often countries don't necessarily have a central one where all the data, let's say on health, or all the genomic data is in one place. They might have 10, 15, 20 more database. In Canada, it would be probably more between 50 and 100 for human data, I would say, for different disease, different condition, genomics, non-genomics, proteomics, all kinds of other field. And so we have all these databases. They're all expensive. Governments were excited to fund them the first time around, but they don't want to fund them anymore because it's not so cool to say, well, I've created a database. Now I'm going to give 20 million just to maintain it. That doesn't sound as exciting as when you created it the first time around. So it's really difficult. And now what happened with the change of president in the US is that the Trump administration has basically put on freeze all the renewal of their big biobanks and database. So there's a wind of panic among genomic researchers who all of a sudden are wondering what they're going to do to maintain their collection. Because basically, if you don't have the money to maintain those infrastructures, there's two alternatives that come to mind. One, I scrape my data, and that's extremely frustrating. You're basically destroying, asset for the healthcare system, which have great value. The second thing is I give my data to somebody that can afford to maintain the infrastructure. But are they going to use it for the same purpose, same condition? Would people that have provided the data be happy with that? So that's the question of sustainability. It really summarized. Now let's move into cybersecurity and dual use for the last part of my presentation. This is, by the way, the Shenzhen Biobank. That's not too far from here. I was one of the first person that got the opportunity to visit it a few years back. You can imagine how much that kind of infrastructure must cost. I mean, mind you, this is probably the biggest one in the world. But you know, we're talking billions of dollars for sure. And this is an infrastructure that store human genomic data, animal data, and also environmental data as well. So it's a huge biobank. So when we talk about dual use, what we're trying to say is that we're talking about research that can be used both for health, for therapeutic purposes, but also for more dangerous purposes, such as biological weapon warfare, etc., or to stigmatize more simply. Uh, and so until recently, we didn't really talk about genomic data as being a dual use resource. We started by talking about gene editing. We started to see that gene editing was something that could be used in a dangerous way. Basically, it's possible to make modifications. We see it with, for example, experiment on insect species, where we're starting to be in controlled environment to extinguish complete species of insect that would carry malaria, for example, or other types of disease like that. If we can do it with insect, it stands to reason that given enough time, more knowledge, we probably can do something similar for human, and that's pretty scary. So that's the idea behind, you know, thinking about gene editing as something that could be potentially a dual use uh, resource. But of course, we hear about synthetic data as well being potentially dual use. And more recently, it's tend to reason that genomic data in itself could be misused because in any case, the gene editing, you know, if you want to do gene editing, you have to start by doing genomic research to identify what it is that you actually want to edit. And so genomic data is part of that process. And we can stigmatize, we've seen it in publication by researchers that were not necessarily ill-intentioned, but that were careless and where their research finding was used to stigmatize. For example, we can think about researchers that identified what they called at the time a warrior gene in the Maori population in Australia. And that warrior gene was supposedly a gene that would make you more aggressive and more potentially violent, etc. And it was associated with that population group in publications, in several publications, before we realized that, well, that might not be very nice to do. And further than that, the science behind this was not particularly robust. So nowadays, we actually think that there's no such thing, or that there were much more genetic mechanism involved in this than we thought in the first place. And of course, genomic data, especially if we talk about open science, it's so easy to access. So that's also what makes it a little bit more challenging and risky. And the fact that it's so revealing, so rich, that it gets very easy to re-identify people from just a few polymorphism. So very small bits of genetic data. And we see this in forensic genetics. It takes very little to identify people. And there are now companies that specialize in, for example, recreating facial models out of just a small genetic sample found on a crime scene. It's not perfect. The science is still a bit off, but not too far. So on that, we conclude that yes, genomic is a dual use commodity. So there are international treaties that deal with questions of biosecurity. The more known one are the Geneva Protocol and the Bioterrorism Weapon Convention. And this is the problem with those tools is, first of all, they were not designed for genomic data. They were designed much before we thought about this. So they're very general, and they don't really have any implementation framework, meaning that they tell you what you should be doing, what you should not be doing in very general terms. But if somebody was to circumvent the treaty, infringe the treaty, it's not very clear how you would be able to enforce it. And so it's very complex to actually apply these international treaty to genomic data. More recently, the World Health Organization has released a framework on biosecurity that is a little bit more useful in the context of genomics. Of course, it's non-binding. It's a framework. It looks a little bit like a checklist that researchers can use in their lab to see if their data uh, carry some risk and what are the things that they should be thinking about to reduce the risk. It's not specific to genomic data, but they do talk about some scenario involving genomics. But that's the closest we have to something useful for genomic data at the international level. It is right now a big concern of scientific organizations. So, for example, the National Academy of Science in the US, in Canada, the Council of Canadian Academy, both of these associations are currently in the development of reports on dual use sciences. So it's really on the front of their agenda right now. And my argument is to say, well, before governments, and they've already started in the US, they've adopted law to prevent data sharing based on biosecurity reasons, in China as well. Before it gets further and governments adopt these laws that are not necessarily useful or informed and that can do more damage than good, I think the scientific community needs to be proactive and needs to, by themselves, engage with each other at the international level, like we've seen before in the past. For example, the Asilomar conference comes to mind, where scientists around the world gathered to discuss about the risk of gene and genetic engineering in the 1970s, to arrive at some conclusion as to what should be done about this. We should have similar discussions at the international level on the topic of biosecurity in this day and age because of the tensions right now around the world. And of course, it's not all about scientists. There are different actors in there. All of these actors have roles, and we should consider that as well. But I still think it's up to scientists to start this debate and start thinking about how they can do their science, how we can do genomic research in a way that is safer, and still continue with data sharing, because I'm a big believer in that. But I do think that there are things that need to be done. And so I'm going to go and end my presentation with some of these things that I think should be done, at least right now, while we're waiting for something that's a little bit more democratic, where we'll see the scientific community gather together and discuss these questions. So first of all, I think we need to have a more systematic use of some of the best practices in the field. And some of the best practices in the field are, of course, using encryption with your data, so that any directly identifying information is either removed or encrypted. And we also need to use controlled access, where basically you don't provide access to everyone. People have to register, demonstrate that they're responsible scientists, and then you give them access. Nowadays, the trend is also to go towards what we call data visiting and federated data models. And what this is that you can view the data in a secure enclave. You cannot, the data is not going to leave the place, the database that has gathered the data sets. You can view it in a secure environment, doesn't leave the country, doesn't leave the institution. So it's much safer. You're not downloading the data. And we can even push it one stage further, where you can't even see the data. You can query it. and you can see the answer only to your question. So all of these are things that you can do to make sure that you're limiting the type of data that people have access to, but that they can still do their research. Of course, still think about what's happening everywhere else, because it's also important to see where are their data breaches, how is data breached, and what is it used for, so that we can have much more informed practice in the future. Developing cybersecurity protocols that are tailored to your data set. So every genomic research project should think about, if they're a large scale, if they're sharing their data, having these kinds of tailored guidelines, protocols, framework to inform the scientists working on the data of what are prudent, reasonable practices to work with genomic data. I think that one low-hanging fruit that I really want to see done is a guideline on how to publish genomic studies that associate members of specific groups with a specific genetic condition or adverse effect. There are ways to publish these studies with the proper nuances, the proper descriptions of population group, etc. And following these advices will not make it risk zero, but it will reduce the possibility for people to misuse the data for racist purposes, for discriminatory purposes, etc. So there are things that can be done, and I don't buy in the reasoning of some scientists that will say, well, we're just publishing, good scientific results. Yes, they might be good scientific results, but it doesn't prevent one to publish it in a way that is sufficiently nuanced, sufficiently responsible to reduce the risk that they be misused. And I think it should be done in cases like this. And I think guidelines would be very helpful. I also see the expansion of forensic genomics as a very scary phenomenon. So some of the biggest database of genomic data are government databases. Uh, China, some of the biggest, the US also again, your main players, they have huge databases. For example, nowadays, there's so much genomic data out there that a person of European descent, so Caucasian like me, probably 85 to 90% chance of finding a second degree relative of mine somewhere around the world in an open genomic database, which is pretty scary because I've never participated in any genetic project, but I could still eventually be linked to somebody who has done that through other types of data set. So that's why genomic information and privacy is a complex combination, and we can't promise a perfect result. And I'll end my presentation there so that we have time for a question. I'm happy to present some of the government's tool if time permits, and if there are questions on some of the specific tools. But yes, I wanted to thank everyone for attending and open this to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Yan, for your compelling presentation.